Great, so let's take a look at functions. Now, if you've read the accompanying text, you will know that functions basically are just reusable blocks of code. So let's start writing some functions. Now, you'll probably have already read this, but we're going to go into slightly more depth and have a bit of a talk about what each component of a function actually is and why it's useful. So how do we actually just declare a function? Well, in JavaScript, it's really easy. All we need to do is we need to say, use the keyword function. Let me just zoom in a little so that you can see this easier. Use the keyword function. And then we need to think of a name for our function. So in this instance, what I want this function to do is just to greet our user in the console. So we're going to say hello, whatever, hello name, hello George in this instance. So we say function, and then I'm going to give it the name of greet. Now we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but you should use kind of the correct, you should try and use meaningful names for your functions. So we could call this whatever we want. We could call this Dave if we wanted, but that's not very descriptive. So this function is greeting, so we should use the word greet. We add some parentheses afterwards, and we can put things in these parentheses, but we'll come to that in a moment. And then we open up some curly brackets in order to then write our block of code. So what I want this function to do is just to log out the words hello and then a name. In my instance, I will say hello George. So in here, we will say console.log hello George. Excellent, so I'm going to save this, and then if you're using the starter code, this is all linked up already for you. If not, you will just need to put some boilerplate HTML code in and link up your app.js file there as well. So I'm just going to click on my index.html, open with live server. This will probably open on my second screen, in which case we'll bring it over. And let me just set up my screen so that I can flick between the two screens as expected. Fantastic, so let's open the console here. Okay, absolutely no worries with this. It's just because we haven't got a favicon and stuff, so just refreshing the page has got rid of that error. Okay, so we've got nothing here. Why is that? We've written our code, we've written our console.log, hello George, there. Why is it not appearing in the console? Well, one of the kind of gotchas, if you like, with functions is that, yes, you can write all of your code in them, but unlike when we just write code in our JavaScript file that will execute on its own, if we were to write, say, console.log hi here, you see that we get that hi in the console. Anything that's within a function, we then have to invoke that function. We have to kind of call that function. We have to say, hey, I want you to run the code that you have got inside you. So the way that we do that is we literally just say the name of the function, and then we invoke it using parentheses. So if we save this now, you'll see that we do actually get that hello George. Okay, well, that's great. Why didn't we just put that console.log outside of this function? Why did we go to all of the effort of writing this function here? Well, the thing is, we can now go ahead and run this function as many times as we like. Let's say we had some code in here that had to run, I don't know, 100 times or 1,000 times. Well, writing it once is much, much easier. And maybe we then write a loop to call that function again and again. So this kind of code block here means that we can write it once and we can run it many, many times. And that's a concept called dry, or don't repeat yourself. So great, we've got our function running. Let's have a look at some of the other things that we can do with functions. So we've got our greet function there. One of the things that we can do is we can kind of have functions do different things depending on what we kind of give them to run, what we pass into the functions. So let's say, so here in this greet, we know that my name is George, so we've said hello George. Well, what happens if the name of the person we want to greet changes? So let's write another function, and we do that again with function keyword. And I'm just going to call this function greet name. And then we add some parentheses, and of course we'll need some curly brackets to put our code block in. Well, I said that we'd come back to these parentheses here. And inside these parentheses, what we can do is we can actually add parameters. So these are kind of a little bit like variables that are available in our function that we can then pass into our function when we invoke it. So I'm just going to think of a name here and for this parameter. And it is name, you know, it's somebody's name. So we might as well call it that. And again, it's a good idea to keep these kind of what they are. So if this was somebody's age, we should probably call it age. If it's somebody's name, we should probably call it name. Something that makes sense. And then you see this name is then available inside this function for us to use. So here we can say console.log hello, and then I'm just going to add a plus to concatenate these together, and name. So if we save this, again, we get nothing output from that function because, of course, it's not being invoked, it's not being called. So what we can do is down here, we can say greet name, and then have the parentheses in order to invoke that function. And in here, we can put, for example, Nigel or Susan. So in these parentheses, we can then put a name. So I will put the name of Nigel. Some friends of mine had a dog called Nigel, so that's why I have used that. Okay, so let's save that. And you'll see that we get hello Nigel printed to the console, because what we've done is we've actually passed this string into our function under the parameter of name. Now you'll notice that we didn't get a space between hello and Nigel. That's nothing to do with the function. That's just because we've concatenated it here without the space here. Of course, then we can also say here greet name and pass something else, another argument into our function. So we will say here Janet. So again, you'll see that we've been able to call our function with hello Nigel, and then we've also been able to say hello Janet. So even though our arguments here have changed, our code here in the function remains the same. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Of course, we have single. We've just given it one parameter here, and just for the record, when it's here, this is called a parameter, but when it is here, this is called an argument. Now, you may hear people incorrectly referring to them the wrong way round, and I must admit, I've done that in the past. Hey, you may even hear me say it in the future in these videos. But it is just important to remember that these arguments get passed into our functions as parameters. So let's actually now write a function that has a bit more information. We need to pass lots of different or a few different pieces of data into our functions. So we'll say function describe person, and then parentheses and curly brackets. So what I want to do here is I want to pass in the person's name, age, and location. So what we can say here is we can actually put multiple parameters on our function. So we'll say name, and then we add a comma and a space, and then we'll use age, for example, and a comma and a space, and location. And these parameters will be available for us to use inside this function. So what we can say here is console.log, and let's use template literals for this because I think it'll be a bit easier to read. So we'll say name is age, years old, and is from location. And you'll see that what we've done is we've used all of these parameters inside our function here. So how do we then call that function with multiple arguments? Well, it looks very similar to this and to this. If we were to kind of put these two together, I'm sure you could work it out. So feel free to pause the video and try this yourself if you think you know the answer. Otherwise, let's continue. So what we'll say here is we'll say describe person, and of course I can use autocomplete there. We add our parentheses in order to call the function, and then we can just add our name. So in this instance, we'll say Sam, and Sam is 29 and is from London. So if I save that now, you'll see that we were able to pass in all three of those arguments into our function. Now there is something to bear in mind here, that these are what's called positional arguments, and we'll get onto the different types of how we can pass data into our functions later on. But for now, make sure that you put things in the correct order when you've written the function. So, for example, if we were to call describe person with a location of Paris and a name of Gerald and then an age of 72, and we save that now, you'll notice that it's still passed everything in exactly the same order that we gave it, but it doesn't necessarily make sense. So it's really important to make sure that you pass the correct data into the correct positions. Now, you could put some checking in your function here. So for example, you could make sure that your name was a string and your age was a number and your location was a string. You could even go and look up in lists of data. But for now, what I want you to take away is that these positions must correspond correctly with how you've declared your function. Okay, that's how we've kind of got data into a function, and we're calling upon the console to print things out to the console. But how do we get kind of data out of a function? Well, let's go ahead and write a function called return greeting. So we'll say function return greeting, parentheses and curly brackets, because that's what we kind of want to do. We want the function to return something to us. Well, you'll notice that I'm using that word quite a lot, and that's because we use the keyword of return. So if I want to actually get something out of the function, we use the return keyword, and we'll practice this loads throughout the course. So don't worry if it doesn't make too much sense right away. So we'll say return, and in this instance, I'm just going to say, hi, George. So if we save that now, we don't get anything because we've not invoked it. So let's go ahead and invoke it. So we'll say return greeting, and this requires no arguments because there's no parameters here. And if we save this now, we still get nothing in the console. Well, that's because we've not actually said return it to the console. So in this instance, if we actually want to print this hi George to the console, what we'd need to do is we'd need to wrap our return, well, actually, let's just write this out again so that we can see the two different kind of what's different between it. We would then actually have to say console.log return greeting, and we'd still need to invoke that function. So if we do Command S on there, say, hey, fantastic, we've got the hi George. So what's actually happening there? Well, we're saying here on line 28, go and console.log whatever is returned from this return greeting function. And what we get returned is hi George. What we can also do is we can save this in a variable. So what we could say here is const polite greeting equals, and then we'll say return greeting. We will call that function. And then let's go ahead and just console.log that out. So console.log, and then we'll say this is our polite greeting. Actually, let's just do this a bit nicer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that, and I'm just going to put it in some quotation marks. And then after this, we're just going to add another argument to our console.log, and this will be polite greeting. And what we should get is the string of polite greeting, and then whatever is returned, whatever is inside this variable here. So if I save this now, yep, we get polite greeting, hi George. Absolutely wonderful, because we're saying go and print to the console whatever is inside this variable here. So that's how we can save kind of the result of whatever our functions have done. That could be some maths, that could be going and getting something from a database, that could be doing a whole load of number crunching to then put it in a variable to then go and do something else with that. Might be just return it to the user, might be then to go and do further calculations or data crunching, or maybe to save something to a database. So one of the things that I do want to show you is just some of the other ways that we can kind of write our functions. So we've seen this way of doing it. This is called a function declaration. This is declaring a function. Well, we've also got function expressions. And what we can do is we can actually kind of save our functions, the functions themselves, into variables. So what I'm going to say here is I'm going to make a variable, const expression. And again, you could call this anything, but this is just a very basic thing so that you can kind of look back on it later. So const expression, and then we'll say equals function. And then we don't need to think of a name because we've already thought of a name here. We've already thought of this kind of variable name here. So this expression is a function, curly brackets. And again, we could pass arguments into here as these parameters. but I'm just going to say console.log. This is a function expression. So if I save that now, of course, we'll get nothing printed to the console, but I can say here expression and then parentheses. So save that. And yeah, there we go. This is a function expression. So we kind of call upon those functions in the same way, and we can still pass parameters in here. We can still pass arguments in here, but it's just a different way of doing it. And there are some quirks that we'll come on to later on in the course. Let's have a look at just one other way of kind of declaring these function expressions. So what we can use is something called the fat arrow. So I'm going to say here const fat arrow equals, and again, so we're still putting this function inside a variable. We'll just put our parentheses here without the function keyword. There's no function keyword when we do this. And again, we could pass arguments in here if we wanted to. But then what we need to do here is we need to use equals and then the kind of the greater than sign. Now, this is not equal to or greater than. This is not, even though it looks kind of similar to that operator, this is what's called a fat arrow. And then we have curly brackets. And in here, we can then do anything that we could do with the function. So here I will just say console.log fat arrow function. And we call upon it in the same way. So we'll say fat arrow and parentheses. So let's just save that. And there we get the fat arrow function. Now it's entirely up to you which of these you use. Do you prefer how the function declaration looks here with function and then the name for the function? Do you prefer putting the function into a variable with a function expression like this? Or do you prefer the fat arrow like we've used here? Now it's kind of up to you, and there are quirks between each of them. But it's, for the most part, it's entirely up to you which one you use. The reason I wanted to show you them now is because if you're Googling for solutions or for syntax in your code, you might see any one of these used as an example. So it's important to know that this is kind of, or basically, the same. Sorry, here, this expression is basically the same as using the fat arrow. And they both do kind of the same thing as the function declaration here. So it's just something to bear in mind. So there is just one thing that I want to talk about, and that's something called scope. Now let's go ahead and just write a function that adds two numbers together. And then we'll talk about how scope affects how we write our code and how that relates to functions. So I'm going to write a function called add, because we're going to add two numbers together. Add our parentheses. And then we'll say num1 as our first parameter and num2 as our second parameter. Now we need to add our curly brackets. And what I want to do here is just to make it really kind of explicit what we're writing. What we could do is we could, of course, just go ahead and return num1 plus num2. That would work as a function. But what I want to do here is I want to explain how kind of variables in functions work. So we're going to write this out a little bit more kind of verbose. So what I'll do here is I will say const result is num1 plus num2. So now that result, the result of that addition will be saved in this result variable. So let's go ahead and run our function, call our function. So we'll say add, and then just think of two numbers, I don't know, 5 and 7. You can choose any numbers that you like. Now I want to go ahead and get that result and print it to the console. Now this, to some of you, you might be thinking, why are we doing this? Well, it's just to demonstrate how we can get our variables. So I'm going to say here console.log our result, because we've declared that variable here, right? And we want to be able to log it out here. Okay, so let's save that. Okay, so we've got a reference error here, and it says that result is not defined. That's it, and that's weird. App.js, line 50, number 13. That's weird because we've got it here, we have declared it, and we're trying to call it here, or we're trying to get hold of it and print it here. Well, this again is about scope. So this result variable is only available inside this add function. It's what's called locally scoped. So in the same way that you might have a shop that's just in your village, you can only get to it from that village. It is locally scoped. If we wanted to make this globally scoped, we would have to put it outside. Now, this result variable is still available inside this add. So let's here, instead, we'll say console.log our result. And let's actually just put a little message here that says logged inside function. So if we save this now, you'll see that logged inside the function, we do actually get that we can access that variable from inside the function, but unfortunately we cannot get it from outside the function. If we wanted to be able to give this what's called global scope, or where it was available from elsewhere in our application, what we would need to do is we would need to declare the variable here. So we would say const result, and then we could just make it 0, for example. And then here we would, instead of declaring result again, we would reassign the result to whatever num1 plus num2 is. So let's just put a little message in this console.log here so that we can see what happened. Logged globally. So if we save that now, oh, we have an error. Oh, assignment to a constant variable, of course, because we actually want to change that result here. Easy mistake to make, but very easy to change it. So we'll change this to a let variable. Fantastic. So we've got logged inside the function. Yet we were still able to get that global variable of result inside the function. We were also then able to get the result variable from outside the function. So what are the main things that I want you to take away from this lesson? Firstly, functions are reusable blocks of code that we can use any number of times in our software. We can pass data into our functions using parameters and arguments. It's important to know that parameters and arguments are positional, so you need to put them in the correct order. We can sort of change this up with some techniques that we will talk about later on in JavaScript 201. We can also then get stuff out of our function using the return keyword. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can make or write our functions using expressions, or kind of like saving our functions in variables to then use later on. We can use a regular expression here, or we can actually use the fat arrow as well. One thing that really is important, though, to bear in mind is that if you were to declare a variable inside your function, you can only get to that variable from inside the function. If you want to be able to access that variable specifically from outside the function, you will need to declare it globally or outside the function. And then you can go ahead and reassign it here.